From the government overriding teachers' constitutional right to strike to the reaction of other unions and the education minister facing a recall petition. Time now for tonight's politics panel. And joining us this evening, Mount Royal University political scientist Duane Bratt, and Jim Groom is a political scientist recently retired from Medicine Hat College. Good evening to you both. And let's begin with fallout to back to work legislation ending the strike by Alberta teachers.
They've taken the nuclear option on something that they could have avoided. And Albertans will be forgiven for asking themselves, who's next?
Opposition reaction to the Smith government's use of the notwithstanding clause for the first time in Alberta's history, overriding any legal challenges to its back-to-work legislation. Duane, how significant a moment is this in not only the Alberta labour dynamic, but maybe even Alberta labour history?
It's very significant. And let's look at all of the components of what we saw yesterday in Bill 2, the Back to School Act. The first is they ordered them back, and that's a common strategy. We've seen that federally and provincially. But in this case, they're not sending it to binding arbitration. They're actually legislating an agreement. And it's the same agreement that the teachers rejected by 90% only a couple weeks ago. So there is a salary increase in there. There is a promise of hiring new teachers, but only a task force to deal with classroom complexity. So it's legislating an agreement, which violates collective agreements. The second component is time allocation. So they limited debate on this to an hour for each reading of the bill. Now, the NDP tried to put some roadblocks in, but was largely unsuccessful. And so this went from first reading to third reading and passing in the span of an evening. And then the third is using the notwithstanding clause that violates the charter around labor rights and doing so preemptively. So not in the aftermath of a court decision. They know that this violates the charter rights. They know it can't be saved under Section 1. And they know even before the courts rule that it is wrong, and they're doing it anyway.
So, Jim, when you take this in its entirety, where do you see this leaving the right to strike as part of the collective bargaining process?
Well, this may be reflective of a bigger scheme by the government to strategically attack rights of public service employees, because they really have set a precedent here. Although the Premier has said that this is a one-off, it really looks like they're trying to take an attack at public sector and simply say that, no, we will dictate to you what we want. They had their 12% in mind. They didn't negotiate during the summer hardly at all. They were almost took the summer off, the government. And then they come back and arbitrarily make this decision. And as Duane says, there's no independent dispute resolution process in place. There's no binding arbitration. This is a preemptive strike using the notwithstanding clause, which is really unprecedented to do that. Normally, to invoke the notwithstanding clause is like a last resort after it's gone through the courts and discussed for years, and then they would eventually, play that final card. But to do it this way is just so draconian.
So, Duane, apart from maybe doing some form of look at classroom complexity, what though does now rest on the shoulders of the Smith government in legislating teachers back to work? Has it cleaned its hands of the whole situation?
It thinks it has. But to Jim's point, there could be problems with the rest of the labor movement, because if they can do this to teachers, which group is next? The other is what happens when the teachers are back in the classroom. They've been ordered back. There's some pretty hefty fines if you don't show up to work, both to the individual and to the ATA. But teachers do an awful lot of voluntary work. They coach sports teams, they run clubs, they do lunchtime supervision, they meet with students after hours to provide homework help. Do we see the end of those sort of voluntary duties by teachers, which will really adversely affect students? I will also say that the public had been sympathetic to the teachers, much more so than the government. We've seen that in polling data. But we also know that they want to see the kids back in school. So I think the government is banking on that this will be popular because they're getting kids back in school. but do parents think about the ends justifying the means and the way that the government is going about doing this?
Yeah, Jim, we'll get to the response of other unions in a moment, but are there potential long-term ramifications for the Smith government in having used the notwithstanding clause? Should the Premier bank on the support of Albertans, the support of parents?
No, I think this is a demarcation that will haunt them for the next 2 years until the next election. This is part of the social engineering that the government is determined that they're going to do. Doesn't matter the input that they get. It doesn't matter what the public wants. It doesn't matter what the Alberta voters want. They are pressed between their core in the UCP and their desires and what actually is the desires of the general population. And they're going to have to change spots by the time the election comes up. But people are going to remember, everybody remembers a teacher of renown. When you talk to people that are successful and you say, well, who do you remember in the past? Lots of times they say it was a teacher, my grade 8 teacher, my high school teacher, they sent me on the right path, et cetera, et cetera. You never hear them say it was a politician that was got me on the right path and set me in the direction. So I think this is going to be a long-term consideration that the government's going to pay for.
Okay, now reaction to the government strike ending move does not end with the Alberta Teachers Association.
I just want to make it really clear that if the government puts a gun to the head of the teachers and they're not able to continue their strike, then we in the broader labor movement will stand where they're not able to.
Late last week, a coalition of multiple unions in Alberta, calling itself the Common Front, warned the Smith government against use of the notwithstanding clause to end the strike. It's to agree on a tentative plan of response, and we'll make that apparently public on Wednesday. Now, Jim, how worrisome is the prospect of a general strike in response to the actions of the government here?
Because this would be unprecedented as well, and it really would take the union a strong aspect for the Federation to get everybody together and do this. But it's very symbolic what they've done to the teachers. And I think the rest of the public sector in particular, of course, is looking at this and saying, this is just wrong. And this is setting precedents that there was really no need for it. As Duane has pointed out, they could have easily have resolved this under the labor code. They could have put it in a position where they went to arbitration, and they could have done all kinds of other things instead of taking this sledgehammer and nailing it with the teachers. And all the other unions must be sitting there pretty nervous and saying, well, are we next? And who will stand with us once all the others have gone?
And Duane, what do you expect other unions may be weighing now as they build to a potential response?
But look at 2022. So the Ford government in Ontario did pretty much what the Smith government did yesterday. They used the notwithstanding clause to end a teacher strike in the province, and they backtracked within a couple days because there was so much opposition by the other labor movements, including the teachers, that they forced a retraction from the government. So I think everyone is watching to see what happens over the next several days, particularly tomorrow, which is the first day back at school, and the press conference by the rest of the union movement.
Yep, indeed. Interesting days ahead. Okay, time for us to take a bit of a break, but when we come back, an attempt to recall Alberta's education minister. More from our politics panel in a moment. Welcome back. While much of the focus of late has been on the Smith government's move to end the strike by Alberta teachers, there is an effort of another sort taking aim at Alberta's education minister. Alberta's chief electoral officer approved a petition last week that seeks to recall Calgary-Bow MLA Dimitrios Nicolaides. The applicant now has until January 21st to collect just over 16,000 signatures from eligible voters in the riding. The Calgarian behind the petition says it stems from her frustration with the minister's handling of the public education file. Okay, so Duane, 16,006 signatures. It doesn't seem a lot compared to, say, the nearly 300,000 needed for the Forever Canadian referendum question petition. But how challenged do you feel this recall effort will be?
Oh, it is a challenge because they can only get signatures from people that live in the riding, so not citywide. So don't focus on the overall amount of signatures. Look at the percentage of the signatures in the geographic area. So we know that this is going to be difficult to do. And I also have a problem with this because recall should be about really egregious ethical issues that can't be resolved in any other fashion. This is about a policy debate. This is using recall instead of an election, instead of other ways to change policy. And I don't think that is correct. And I agree with Minister Nicolaitis when he says that. The problem with Dimitri Nicolaitis on this point, though, is in 2015, he argued that recall should be able to be used for everything. And not just restricted to ethical behavior as opposed to policy differences. So he's kind of boxed himself in a bit.
Okay, so Jim, on that same point, frustration over the handling of the public education file, how do you weigh that as rationale for a recall petition? Does it fit the bill?
Yeah, Nicolaitis did a terrible job when he was advanced education minister. You know, his approach towards Athabasca University and firing the president there and firing the entire board so that they could finally get a good board to help them fire the president. You know, those were ethical issues that were really above and beyond what they should have been. He's done a terrible job in the education ministry as well here now. But I think I have to agree with Duane that it really, the design of the legislation was that your MLA is not serving you properly. There may be ethical issues, but it is an MLA that you're recalling. It is his actions in relationship to your constituency in that regard. It's really not about how they are as a minister or how they've acted in that regard in their executive functions. So I have to think that this petition, as much as we don't like the current minister, I don't think this is the proper approach to get him removed.
Okay, we have time for one more topic. That is the Premier's departure last evening on a 9-day trip to the Middle East with stops in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to, as the government's news release states, promote Alberta's investment opportunities, energy expertise, and agricultural products. Jim, how does this play coming off the controversial end of the teachers' strike and so early in the fall sitting of the legislature?
Well, unfortunately, this is sort of typical. You know, when Jason Kenney had Lauren Gibson fired, the elections commissioner, he happened to be in Houston at a conference at the time. And this is not an uncommon technique by politicians generally, but also the UCP seems to use it rather effectively. And I think this is a real discredit when the Premier knows that such a contentious piece of legislation is going forward and then leaves on a junket to another country to perhaps play down the role that she has in this regard. You know, we know that she dominates the UCP and that is her party and she's really in control as the Premier, of course. And to leave at this point, I think is negligent.
Duane, is Alberta that big of a player where Saudi Arabia and the UAE, United Arab Emirates, are concerned? What do you make of the necessity for the Premier to make another trip to the Middle East at this time?
Oh, I mean, we are an oil superpower and gas superpower, just like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So the trip doesn't surprise me. The trip makes a lot of sense. It's the timing of the trip. And I was told last night by the Premier's Chief of Staff that this had been in the works for almost a year. Okay, if that was the case, the government could have chosen when to recall the legislature. So they timed it identical. And it's a really bad look. This was an emergency. That's what they said in the press conference. That's why they're using the notwithstanding clause. That's why they use time allocation. They keep talking about 700,000 kids out of the classroom. So if it was such an emergency, the Premier should be here. And emergencies crop up on trips, and they often have to return home. So I'm not accepting that that the economics of this trip justify leaving in the middle of a major political issue in this province.
So, Jim, if let's say there is a general strike in response to what's happened with the teachers here, does Danielle Smith have to make a quick trip back home?
Well, the optics are terrible that she's out of the country during a period of an emergency of this nature. And if she doesn't, then it's just going to get worse for her. And those are the things people remember. It's funny, you know, you can have all kinds of detailed conspiracy going on, or fraud and you know, other misnomers. But when the premier is absent during a crucial time, when she's supposed to be the leader of the province, it really, people remember that. And when it comes to election time, they'll remember it as well, I think.
All right, gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Great to see you both. Thank you kindly for this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks,
Thanks
Wayne.
Michael.